you want to be a designer, you don't want to be like a decorator. You want what you do to convey meaning and really make change.
Welcome to Hidden Characters, Forrest.
Hi.
For those who don't know, Forrest Huu Ta is a designer who specializes in branding, motion, packaging, and typography. Forrest's work feels alive, carrying a vitality and vibrancy that makes it no surprise that they have contributed to the likes of Apple, Instagram, Ghostwrite, Kraft Heinz, and Ghetto Gastro, among numerous others. Forrest and I met at a Collins event, and when we met, something that came up in our conversation was motion design. And so I want to start by asking, how did you get so good at motion? And was motion something that you learned simultaneously with static design?
Yeah, truthfully, I it was never my intention to learn motion. I think that was actually something I learned from one of my mentors, Chandni. She was very much like, I think motion is going to be the next big thing, and my focus was more on branding. And so, taking her advice, I learned like a little bit of motion to like spice up my portfolio, and just enough to get by. Like I took like Linda course and like did all the tutorials and that was it. It wasn't until I got to Center and my first project was campaign branding for Apple, and it was entirely motion. And so pretty much my first 6 months out of school was like a motion boot camp, and that's where I really got to learn and get better at it under Joe Wright, who is our senior motion designer. Um, and yeah, from there, I just kind of became like the go-to like motion person. And it was cool because, no one at the studio was kind of working in motion. So it was like my own sandbox to myself. And I just got to play around. But yeah, I would say I'm more of like a designer who knows motion than a motion designer. I think there are a lot of motion designers who are way better than me. I just know enough to like get by.
I love that. And that sounds like a nice kind of first project to jump right into Apple.
Yeah, I know. Literally day one, like you're gonna work on Apple, by the way. You need to get better at motion.
And yeah, I guess my follow-up to that, Forrest, is this idea that motion, when I was first learning design, was always seen as like a nice to have skill and not a core competency of the average designer. But as years have passed, it feels like it's becoming more of a fundamental skill that most designers work to develop skills in. And so I'm curious, how do you view motion in the toolkit of a brand designer in 2025?
hmm Yeah, I definitely think I would definitely say it's something you probably should have. You don't need to be an expert at it. I think it's very similar to sort of my introduction is like just take the beginner courses and know a little bit. Um, because I feel like especially in the age that we're living now where everything is like digital, motion is just going to be like ever present. Um, and in my experience at JKR, I actually don't do a lot of motion design. We have a lot of in-house motion designers who work way faster and are way smarter than me. But the fact that I like have worked in motion when we would work on projects together, it was easier to communicate what we were trying to convey because I knew exactly how to execute it. And so when I would give feedback or sort of art direct the work, it was easier to speak to, you know, a motion designer compared to maybe someone who doesn't have motion design is trying to give feedback. I also think knowing a little bit of motion and knowing like what sources to take inspiration from and learn from can help you develop that eye for motion because there is a very like critical eye for what's good motion and what's bad, the same way for like typography and everything else.
Yeah, I love that. I think that being able to be on the same page to communicate with motion designers, whether that's your role or you're just sort of like working together with a motion designer, I think is always helpful. So I love that advice. And building on that, I want to ask you too, Forrest, about industry standard skills. And it seems like some recruiters in this day and age are asking for you to have skills in some kind of combination of 2D design, 3D design, motion design. AI, type design. And it seems like the list is almost endless. And it almost feels like sometimes that they want you to not only be like a jack of all trades, but like a master at each of them individually. And I personally have never met somebody who's checked more than one of those boxes. So I'm curious how you interpret sort of those expectations. And what would you say as somebody who works at one of the larger branding agencies, JKR? How do you think about the expectations for a junior or midweight designer?
Yeah, I would definitely assure you that there isn't a single person out there who's a master of all of it. I think, oftentimes these job listings are written by recruiters who might not fully understand the breadth of what it takes to build out these skills. So, for everybody out there who's getting into the industry for the first time, no, you don't have to know everything. I think the core sort of like skills that you should have are, Photoshop, Illustrator, probably Figma. Figma is very dominant now. And maybe InDesign. And then sort of like the nice to have skills are very much like After Effects, 3D, AI, type design. And those are really like maybe motion design could become like a norm soon, but like for the most part, it kind of relies on like what sort of projects those studios need. And oftentimes it's like usually just Illustrator, Figma, and Photoshop. So, don't worry like too much about being a master at everything. My advice is like really like be really good at the core stuff. So like Photoshop, Illustrator, and Figma, and then go into the sort of skills that interest you because then it's a lot easier to get into if you're passionate about it. So if say you're really into 3D design, like do it for fun. Like I wouldn't do it just to like, because you feel like you need it, unless that's the type of work that you want to do or that's the type of industry you want to go to.
Yeah, and a question that builds on that, I want to ask sort of a question that revolves around portfolio advice. And what you had mentioned about sort of the key hard skills being like the Photoshop, Illustrator, and Figma expertise. I'm curious how you would approach sort of like any tips for demonstrating that you have skills in those programs.
hmm Yeah, my sort of advice and I tell this to everyone who's kind of first starting out, is like really figure out what you like to do and where those places are that do the work that you want to do, and really craft your portfolio around that. Because I feel like, often in school, what sort of the professors tell you is like to learn everything and put it all in your book. And that's not always helpful to like the agencies you're applying for. So for JKR, for example, like we do a lot of brand identity and packaging. And so, I think having skills in like packaging design is super important if you want to get hired at JKR. But compared to like, a studio like Studio Lin, where all they do is like books and some brand identities, learning InDesign and like print publishing is a lot more important than probably packaging. And so, it varies, I think it's more helpful to figure out what you want to do and where you want to go, and then sort of craft your skills and your portfolio around that. Because when these employers are looking for people to hire or to bring on as interns, they want someone who already knows exactly that that's what they want to do, right? And that they've sort of ventured on their own to figure out what they needed to learn, as opposed to as opposed to being a student who has a little bit of everything but is kind of like directionless in terms of portfolio. Like, UX UI is super cool to have, but at JKR, we don't do that in the New York office. And so it might not be like a skill that we require right away. It's a nice to have. But for JKR specifically, I would say the New York office, it's mostly like brand identity and packaging.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's great advice to sort of bring some focus into the direction you want to take your work in so that you attract that kind of work. And then you had mentioned internships, Forrest. It was very impressive to me that you've done 4 internships, named at the San Diego Museum of Man, Interscope Records, Future Brand, and the Working Assembly. I'm wondering if you could talk about those experiences and if you have a takeaway from each of them.
Yeah. So I think in school, I kind of had a sense that I was gonna learn more on the job than I would in classes. And so, um, I made sure to really devote my time to doing internships. Um, and I also wanted to treat internships as an opportunity to learn about what type of work environment I wanted to work in. And so that's why I have a lot. I think at the beginning I was kind of just like trying everything. So I worked at like a museum and then I worked at a record label and I realized I kind of didn't want to work in-house. I feel like it was kind of hard being the only designer for the whole company as opposed to working in like places where everybody's a designer. And so, after Interscope Records, I was applying to brand agencies. And that really like working at Future Brand and the working assembly really showed that that's where my passions lie because, everybody, including the project managers and strategists, they understand design better because they work in an environment where design is important, right? In terms of like what I've learned, I would definitely say like kind of what I said before was that when I was at Interscope Records, I asked them, you know, why did you pick me out of a pool of applicants? And they were like, oh, it's because you have album packaging in your portfolio and we're a record label. So we want someone who is passionate about music, who cares about, you know, uh, music marketing and cares about like tour graphics and all those things. And you're kind of the only applicant who showed that in your portfolio. So, I feel like subsequently I kind of like learned to like change my portfolio to fit the place that I'm applying for. So when I was applying to Future Brand and the Working Assembly, I removed a lot of stuff and then replaced all of it with like branding and packaging projects because I knew that those spaces needed more of that. Or that was kind of the businesses that they took on. And so yeah, that's learned a lot. Got burnt out doing 4 internships during the school year, but I feel like my advice to anybody who's in school now, like really use those internships as an opportunity to figure out like where you want to go because you never know. There might be a place where you think you want to work and then you get there and you realize it's not the environment you want to be in. And it's easier to learn while you're still a student.
Yeah, I love that. I think that using those experiences as like an opportunity for discovery, for deciding like which area you want to focus in is great advice. And I think that's important advice too about sort of like being able to adapt and to make your kind of book contextually appropriate to wherever you're applying to. I think that's great advice. And so, following those internships, you went on to work for Center Design before joining JKR. And being a fan of Alex Center and sort of hearing him talk about intentionally keeping his studio nimble, I'm curious if there's any nuances to working at different scales, because JKR, of course, is a more sort of like large scale global branding agency, sort of contrasted with Center.
Yeah, it's very different. I think when I was at Center, the most people we had was 12 people. And then currently at JKR, I think the New York office alone has like 120 people. So 10 times larger. I will say, like, I think on a smaller studio, I feel like you slightly had a bigger say in the type of creative work that you wanted to take on and what you wanted to put out into the world. I think when you work at a bigger company, oftentimes it's like there are more mouths to feed, so you often have to take like big budget projects, right? Um, and oftentimes, like, some of the more fun creative projects are typically the smaller clients who can't pay. And working as a smaller studio, you can sort of take these sort of pro bono projects in addition to a big brand. Whereas maybe working at a bigger studio, it's like a little bit harder to dedicate that time to more pro bono projects. That said, I do think working at a big agency, I've made a lot of friends here who are also talented. You get access to like a bigger network. You get access to people who are expertise in their fields. Like I specifically went to JKR because I wanted to learn from strategists and accounts people who that's all they did, right? Like learning how to present and talk to a client and how to like show your work and really convince and win the job. And I feel like at Center, like we did have like a strategist come in from time to time, but for the most part, the designers are pretty much doing like wearing a bunch of hats. Um, and working at a bigger place, you get, a diverse amount of people that you can learn from. So I think there's sort of like pros and cons to both. I think it's just a matter of what you're seeking.
I'm going to quickly interrupt my conversation with Forrest to tell you about the sponsor of today's episode, Drawdown Books. Drawdown Books publishes and sells books about graphic design, typography, illustration, photography, art, and architecture. When it comes to graphic design, they carry everything from the classics like The Elements of Typographic Style by Robert Bringhurst and Grid Systems by Joseph Miller Brockman, all the way to the newest of releases. I think that books may be the very best way to learn about design and its history. I certainly think so, and have ordered from Drawdown plenty of times in the past. If you too are interested in learning about design through books, I highly recommend you check out Drawdown's collection on their website at draw-down.com, which is also in the description. And now back to my conversation with Forrest. Yeah, I love that. And like just from my kind of experience, I like the idea of being able to wear more hats. So that's why like a smaller place is sort of appealing to me. And
Yeah.
I can see the kind of pros and cons of each.
Yeah. I feel like at Center, I was like, it was definitely very like you learned everything because you had to. And that's also great too. And then, the other way of learning is kind of learning from people who've already done it before you. And so I think both ways are valid. I think you could go either way.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm curious now with your position at JKR, what does your average day look like for us? And are there any hard truths that aren't talked about when it comes to working the studio life, whether it's large scale or a more nimble studio?
Yeah. I will say for everyone who's on social media, all the glitzy, sexy, like glam work that you see is like a fraction of what actually goes on in an agency. Um, and that's kind of like my hard truth to everybody is like, I think when you're first starting out, you might not be put on the more sexier projects. Like, I think I was very lucky that my first project out of school was Apple. I think that's actually a very rare experience. Oftentimes, like people who are first starting out, they're put on these projects where it's like creating like banner ads or like newsletter graphics, like very simple stuff, right? But not stuff that maybe you'd want to put in your portfolio if that's not what you want to do. So yeah,
Unfortunately,
that's sort of
that's how my kind of turn of events went. I didn't go from school to Apple. Unfortunately, I went from school to paid ads.
no, literally. And what's funny is that like the hard truth of that is like that really is where the money is. It's like that's kind of why these agencies who take on these clients and these projects is not because they, you know, stand to benefit from having it in their portfolio. It's like it's the work that pays our salaries, and so it's still valid work, but it's also work that's not typically shown publicly. So I think my sort of hard truth for anyone who's listening is like it's totally okay if you're doing work just to pay rent. Like, I think at the end of the day, you need to put dinner on the table. And so like it's still valid graphic design. And eventually as you work your way up, you will get those opportunities where you work on the more like sexier, glamorous projects. But don't get too hard on yourself.
Yeah, I love that. And I've also over time come to like appreciate the more kind of pragmatic work too. Like I used to, I guess when I was in school, I used to think like I used to demarcate it between like boring work and exciting work. But now it's like I've kind of come to appreciate sort of like the kind of value of visual communication in general and how whether that's doing something that's like sort of maybe generally perceived as less exciting, I still think like being able to provide that value through like through your craft, I think is just as valid. Um,
Yeah. I
that,
mean, everybody needs like newsletter graphics. Like everybody has like a Substack now. So it's extremely valuable because everybody needs that, not everyone needs a rebrand every single year, what they need are like graphics that they can put on their socials. So
yeah, I love that. I remember this was like probably a couple of years ago, but I had this realization of that idea that the projects that you see from studios are usually like they're more kind of sexy projects because I remember I was talking with the designer and he was like, "Yeah, I was doing some like work for the studio and we were working on like, I won't name them, but like X clients. And I was like, wait, I haven't seen that case study. And then I was like, yeah, they must not be like case studying like, and then you come to learn that like only a fraction of the work that's being produced by studios is the work that you see when
Yeah.
like viewing from afar.
Yeah, yeah, it's very much that like iceberg meme where it's like it's much I can tell you for a fact it's like there's a lot of work that people don't see out in the world.
Yeah, and then in terms of working collaboratively, because like you mentioned, like at a place like JKR where there's like 120 people, I'm sure you're interacting with many people on a day-to-day basis. And this is more a question revolved around working with other designers. But are there any pet peeves you have when it comes to working with other graphic designers? Like, do the files need to be labeled in a certain way for you, Forrest? Are you OCD about any of that stuff?
I am OCD, but I don't know. Maybe this isn't answering the question. I don't consider it a pet peeve, but I do think it's good practice to package your files and always have your files uploaded to the server. I work exclusively off the server so that if any of my coworkers need my files within 5 seconds, it's all on there. And all they have to do is just open it and all the fonts and the images are linked because that's kind of like a huge headache to deal with, right? Is like the fonts aren't included or like the images aren't linked so they're low res. So yeah, not a pet peeve, but really good practice is like upload all your files to the server, work off the server if you can, and like package your files so that everybody has everything they need. If you go on vacation, you don't want them to bother you about files.
Yeah, I love that. And as somebody who's like OCD about typefaces, when like you don't package your files and then you see it's like a different serif in like the final, you're like, then yeah, the only person you can blame is yourself. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then so I want to ask you too, Forrest, about like having had so many kind of like fruitful work experiences. I'm curious, do you have like a favorite project from your career so far, even though you're still early on in your career? And I'm curious, like on top of your favorite project that you've contributed to, do you have a favorite project that you were not part of but you appreciate from afar?
Hmm. Yeah, I would say my favorite project so far is probably Ghostwrite. It was one of those very, very rare moments where the client was just like really digging the work that we were doing. And, it's so rare for like a client to like your work every single round. And that's what it felt like. I think I was like one of the three directions presented, and every single round the client kept picking mine. And so what you see today is actually very close to what sort of our initial sketches were. And we got to do a lot of cool typography and motion and like brand activation stuff. And I had no idea that it was going to be picked or anything. I was just kind of like going about my day. And then, it kind of became like the unicorn project for me. In terms of project that I was not a part of, but I do admire, I would probably say like the Impossible rebrand at JKR, largely because they were like able to convince the client to change their brand colors, which is like also so extremely rare because every like brand is so attached to like their branding like set of color palettes. And if you don't know, like Impossible originally was like this like green minty color because Impossible is like a plant alternative meats, right? And they were working in that space. And, the brilliant minds at JKR, like the strategists and the designers, like they were able to convince the client, like, oh, if you want to get, meat eaters into your products, like you have to convey a more meaty feeling to your brand. And what that means is changing your brand colors from greens to like reds because meat is red. And so, yeah, like I think that project wrapped up right before I joined and they presented the case study work to the company. And I was like so impressed that they were able to convince everybody on the client side to jump on board with this well thought out, well designed, rebrand. And I think, that kind of project is like sort of the aspiration, right? Because you want to be a designer, you don't want to be like a decorator. You want what you do to convey meaning and really make change. So yeah.
I love that insight from like that came from the strategists about like initially you want to sort of be that anomaly and like you want to present yourself outside of the sort of brand category, but sometimes like it's almost more effective to make yourself familiar, so that people like don't feel like it's something that's too far out of reach.
Right. And I think the challenge was like, I think it's like less than 5% of people in the world are like vegetarian or vegan. And so ultimately, if you're impossible, like you have there's an untapped market of meat eaters who might love your product, but like how do you use design to convey that to get them on board because they might not be into it, right? And so it makes total sense to like really cue like that sort of like delicious meat, qualities to the rebrand so that you get this new audience excited for your product.
Yeah. And are there any projects outside of JKR that you weren't involved with that you sort of have an appreciation for?
Hmm. I'm gonna have to think about that one. There's so many. Um, I would probably say this might be like a really like unexpected one, or maybe not. I don't know. I think the Brat album was really cool. Because it's like, and what's funny is that like, I got to listen to the creative director who worked on it, and he said, the idea was totally by Charlie XCX herself. Again, I think I'm really attracted to those projects where it kind of just goes against the grain and really like shifts culture. Like I remember when I'm a huge Charlie XCX fan, and I remember when that album artwork was shown and all of the fans hated it. They were like, all her diehard loyal fans were like, why would you pick such an ugly color? Why would you pick such an ugly font? Like, why aren't you sexy? Why aren't you slaying? All those kinds of things. And, I think in an interview, she was like, yeah, I picked those things because I wanted to provoke people. I wanted people to really get like turned off by it and to generate buzz. And that's what actually ended up happening. And it's funny because I think in the interview, she talks about how like her own team was so against it too, but she stood by it and was like, I want to provoke people with this album. I want to generate a lot of press and get people like really intrigued by what's going on. And I mean, it ended up being a meme. Like everybody was using that font and that color. And because it was like so easy to replicate, it was like everywhere. And I think for anyone who's like listened to Charlie's interviews, it tells a lot about how smart she is about marketing and how she knows how to like grab the attention of the audience because there's no way she came up with that out of thin air. Like it took many years for her to come up with and for her to really push that idea out into the world and catch lightning in a bottle. It's like so fucking cool. So I would probably say not a branding project, but maybe like an album branding project. The Brat cover is probably like one of my favorites.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn about branding and sort of like marketing from that project. And yeah, I think that none of that stuff is arbitrary. And I think there's a lot of put into those decisions. And then having like the confidence to sort of like see those through. And when you get sort of those negative reactions initially, to sort of like weather the storm and to sort of stand on your decision and see it through. And that's usually sort of where the light is. Like, and yeah, it's sometimes like you see these rebrands and when they first get released when there's any like negative sort of feedback. There's sometimes you see like the instant sort of like reversal. And I think just for a lot of these branding processes, I think it's helpful to sort of know that you have put thought into the process. And so that whatever the reaction is, knowing that you've put the thought in and that it's aligning with like sort of the future vision of whatever you're working on. And then sort of
Mhm.
like just being able to have the confidence to lead with that and like regardless of what the initial feedback is because of course people have their own attachments to different brands.
Yeah. Yeah, like I don't know. I think what I love about the Brat album is that it's still not pretty. Like it's still very ugly, but that's the intention. And I think people often forget that. Like you're designing with intention. Like I think everyone, it's like it makes sense. You want to make everything pretty and attractive to gain attention, but I also think sometimes the opposite works too. And so, yeah, I think it's freaking cool whenever people change culture and really shift opinions, even if it's a controversial one or one that, gets a lot of flack, but ends up winning notoriety. Like props.
Yeah. And I also want to ask you, Forrest, I saw some of your posts about your recent travels to Japan, where you were posting about some of the typography you were seeing. And I'm curious, like from some of your travels and observing typography from other cultures, are there any takeaways that have come from that that you want to share?
Yeah. Funny you should ask that because actually when I was in Japan, I went to this like bookstore and got these like vintage magazine from like the 80s. And they're like full of like so much cool typography that I'm gonna scan and upload to an archive. But I don't know. I think there's like I what I love about traveling is seeing how people treat typography. What's really fascinating about Japan in particular is that you can read their alphabet vertically and horizontally. It's typically not the same for English, and so it's like really cool to see how they lay out typography in like an editorial setting, or like how they treat it with like hand lettering. It's also really cool to see how like other cultures do their take on like English words and give it a lot more expression, or find ways to like add humor or like quirk to it. I feel like sometimes for Americans, we might be, or like Westerners, we might be a little bit too serious with typography. It can feel very like type out of the can, or very like, Helvetica, Helvetica, Helvetica. And sometimes it's like, we need those sort of little like motifs or little symbols or little like little touches that give each sort of typography like its own special thing. Yeah. I love looking for type inspiration. Definitely recommend it for anybody who travels. Like really just like stop for a moment, like find some signage you like, or find a bookstore that you've heard of, and really like check out the typography because there's so much cool stuff out there that hasn't been discovered yet.
Yeah, I love that. I think I vouch for giving character to your typesetting and not just doing the Helvetica left aligned. You know?
Yeah, I mean, there's a time and place for that. Like, I love Neuhaus Grotesque. Like, I use it for everything because it is a neutral typeface. But yeah, for like display fonts, like have fun with it. Make it more personal. Like, give it a little hat. I don't know.
Yeah, those were all the questions I had for you, Forrest. And so I just want to say thank you for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts. And I always like to conclude with a segment that's in the spirit of why the show started, which is to give recognition to some of the designers behind the impressive projects that are coming out. And so, in that spirit, is there anybody that you want to shout out or you'd love to see featured on the show?
Yeah, I'm gonna pick two people. They're both friends of mine, and they're also sort of like I consider them mentors because they were the people who really got me into motion design when I was still a student. First shout out goes to Chandni Podar. I think she's based in Mumbai currently, but she does a lot of really cool illustration, motion, design, typography work. I think some of it's been featured in like Fast Company or the New York Times. And then my other shout out would be Gabriel Reeves. He's a brand designer who does a lot of motion stuff. His like taste and eye for design is like impeccable. And yeah, he's just killing it out there. Two, great friends who really influenced my trajectory and are still doing great things out in the world.
Amazing. If you two are listening, I'd love to have you on. And in closing, Forrest, is there any best way for people to reach you or to see your work?
Yeah, feel free to DM me on Instagram. Um, yeah, reach out whenever, email me. I like helping out students when I can. I'm not always free. Sometimes work gets a lot, but I usually try to make it my business to respond to people. But if I don't respond, feel free to send a follow-up. That's definitely happened a few times where, someone emails me during like Hell Week, and then they follow up like 6 months later, and I'm like, let's get coffee because I'm totally free. Um, yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll attach your info in the description. And with that, Forrest, thank you so much for coming on and take care.
Yeah. Bye.
Hey, just checking in to say thank you for sticking to the end. It was great to have Forrest on to talk about their exciting work, to give advice, and for them to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of the design industry. If you like the episode and you want to contribute to the growth of the show, consider engaging with the episode by liking or commenting. And there's a couple other episodes that I've already filmed with exciting guests. So the best way to keep an eye out for those is to subscribe. And so I'm going to get back to chopping those episodes up, and I will see you then. See you.